All right, well, let's go ahead and start. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Winter. I'm the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly and vice president of policy for America's Society and Council of the Americas. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, whether you're here on webcast, for what I know is a very important and frankly emotional topic for all of us. This issue of America's Quarterly that we're launching today is about the 4.5 million people who have migrated from one Latin American country to another since 2015. Most of them are Venezuelans, but it also includes Nicaraguans, Haitians, Salvadorans, and so on. And this issue really is about the response. It's not so much about the conditions in the countries they've left behind or the journey that they took to get there, but what the reaction has been like in the countries where they've arrived and the conditions there that they face now. And I have to say that, when you look back at the arc of the last 5 years or so, the response that you've seen from governments and from people within Latin America has been mostly generous and often breathtakingly so. It's inspiring what the region has done, the way people have reacted, the way governments have reacted, often providing visas, work permits, schools in countries where, public services are often strained to the limits and short of resources, even at the best of times. And look, I think we all know in today's context that it didn't have to be that way. It was not written anywhere that so much of the region would respond with that kind of generosity. America's Quarterly focuses on Latin America, but we are based in New York City, and you can hear my accent and you know that I'm an American. And, we're not really planning on touching on this today, but through, basically accident, this issue ended up being published during the same week that the President of the United States enacted new restrictions on immigration. And that sort of provides you with an alternate view of the way that things could have gone. And so I think that in that light, it's especially important to note the generosity with which so many people in Colombia and Peru and Brazil and Chile and Argentina and beyond have generally reacted. Of course, we also know that the reaction has become more complex over the last year to 18 months or so. I was in Colombia in January, and then I spent a week in Peru in February. And I saw firsthand that same generosity, but also the resentment towards migrants and in those cases, Venezuelans in particular. You see this in polls. I'm not, for those of you who are calling in from or watching from those places, what I'm not telling you is it's not a revelation. We've seen growing xenophobia, growing skepticism, fear of crime, a sense of competition for jobs, especially in the working class. And of course, all of this was before the pandemic started. So our goal today is really to send you away with a clear view of what's happening right now, specifically with the Venezuelan diaspora, how things are changing now amid the COVID-19 pandemic, how governments are trying to react, and also what more can be done. A few housekeeping reminders, those of you who are joining us via WebEx, please keep your microphones on mute unless you're talking. And also for those of you who are either on WebEx or watching us on live stream, on Twitter, on YouTube, you can ask questions there by tagging at America's Quarterly. Our three guests today, we really couldn't have a better or more diverse group of panelists. We're honored to have Felipe Muñoz, who is the presidential advisor for the Colombian-Venezuelan border for the Office of the Presidency in Colombia. Felipe is not only a friend and was a contributor to this issue, but I know that he's also widely admired by other governments around the region in terms of what he's done. Luisa Feline Freier, who is an assistant professor at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima, And then Lala Lovera, who is the founder of Fundación Comparte por una Vida Colombia. Thank you, Lala, for joining us as well. I've asked our panelists to make their answers informative, but relatively short, so we can have as much of a conversation as possible. So, Lala, we thought it would be most appropriate to start with someone who is Venezuelan, who is part of the diaspora. You're based in Colombia. And I was hoping that you could tell us kind of what it's like there on the ground right now for Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, and your sense of what it's like in the region generally, and how things have changed as a result of the pandemic over the last 6 weeks or so. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Brian, for this invitation, and thank you, the Americans Quarterly, for making this space. It's so important, and it's an honor to be with Luisa and with Felipe in this panel. Well, as we've been in the field for 2 years and a half, working on the first, like in the front with all these migrants, and this is a drama, Brian. We're facing a huge drama. We were facing a drama, and now, this drama now, amid the COVID-19, it's unimaginable. So all the migrants, the call to action is stay at home. And these migrants, most of them, they don't have a home. They just live like 10 or 20 persons in the same space. So the thing that most it's impacting right now is the hunger that they're facing, because 70% of these persons, of these migrants in Colombia, they live only with informal work. They live in the streets. So their incomes is from the streets. So attending to the COVID or to the hunger, it's like the biggest problem right now. Which one is the pandemic? Okay. So of course we recognize, and I'm all the time saying that Colombia is, as you say it, and in the head of Felipe, all the routes, all the open spaces that the national government had apply here in Colombia, but we need a synergy with the socials, with the civil society, with the private sector. We need the local government to work by hand of the national government, because I think this is the biggest problem that we have, that when the national government will state some issues and some help for these people, when you go to the local, that is not happening. So we need the local governments to start working in synergy with the civil society and the private sector. We need to stop segmenting this population. We need to understand in Colombia, as you say, this is not from just today. This has been happening since 2017. It was a massive migration right there at that moment. And we need to understand that we need to integrate these people, these migrants. They need to be, and they are right now, in every equal, we have an equal immigrant in every in every population in Colombia, since from the top until the bottom. So we have to stop, as a civil society and as a private sector and the local government, we need to stop segmenting these people like they're migrants and Colombians. No, we need to start working together, and we have this pandemic to start doing it. You can't arrive, and Felipe knows that, you can't arrive to this places where all these people are to stay at home and just ask to make two lines. Colombians in one side and migrants and Venezuelan migrants on the other side. We can't do that. This pandemic won't choose nationalities. This virus is not choosing age, gender, disabilities. No, it won't choose. So we need to address the pandemic in the same way. We can't segment the population. That's my call to action. We need to stop segmenting, and because in both ways, if you start addressing to the Colombians and not to the Venezuelans, so the pandemic is there. And we need to have this challenge about integration. I think it has to start moving since from the civil society, because the national government had made all the work, and we need to embrace it.
Yeah. Lala, thank you so much. And I can hear in your voice the urgency of all of this, right? And so thank you for those opening thoughts. And Felipe, over to you. I think as I mentioned, as Lala just mentioned, the Colombian federal government has done so much over the last several years, really, ever since this crisis really entered this new phase. What can you tell us about kind of the latest part of this? What is the Colombian government doing now in the wake of COVID-19 and the imperative that existed before of integrating these new arrivals into the fabric of the country?
Brian, thank you very much. And to Lala and Feline, I'm very glad to be here with all of you. And of course, thank you especially to ASCOA and to America's Quarterly for the latest issue regarding migration. I think this is a very interesting and challenging issue all around Latin America. And thank you very much for letting us be part of this process, of this launch of this issue. I have to say two things. The first idea when we began to thinking about COVID with the President Duque is that the pandemic doesn't ask for passport, neither the government supporting programs. Then we designed a plan with 6 points, trying to address how we can include in a better way, the migrants in the response. Of course, this is the most underfunded migratory crisis in the world right now, and this is a quote from Filippo Grandi, the head of the UNHCR, and we need more money. But still, with our restrictions, we include the migrants and we guarantee the healthcare access for the COVID for all the migrants in the same condition that any Colombian. The second line of work is we decided to close the border for health reasons, for sanitary reasons, because we don't have any epidemiological information from Venezuela. Then we decided just to close the border, but to maintain a humanitarian corridor where more than 3,000 people from Venezuela had decided just to return, which is a tragedy because they don't have any future there, but we still have to maintain a humanitarian corridor. The third point is that we work very closely, as Lala said, in international cooperation agencies and said to them, we need to transform all the programs that we had before in cash, in transfer cash, because as the Venezuela needs now more than 1 million, which are a very vulnerable population, is cash for pay the rents or for buy food. And the fourth line is the President Duque decided to give us 200,000, which is for account for 1 million people, food baskets. And we are distributing these food baskets in 47 municipalities in Colombia, trying to give them a little support for 2 weeks in terms of food. The fifth line of the work is we decided to choose the most intensive work in 4 municipalities: Ipiales at the south border with Ecuador, Maicao in La Guajira, the northern border, Villa del Rosario in norte de Santander, and Soacha, which is very close. In this 4 municipality with the mayors, which, as Lala said, is absolutely crucial to work very closely with the local authorities, we made a special intervention in these municipalities. And the last point, which is the last but not the least important, is the information and coordination. Not only coordination with local authorities, but also with the civil society and the Association of the Venezuelans here in Colombia. They are helping us and distribute the food baskets because there are really, who knows where the people are, because the majority of them are in a regular status. I know that this is not enough. We as a government know that we need more, that this first program is not have any comparison in the region. We are very proud of it, but of course, we need more funds from the international community.
Thank you, Felipe. I mean, one thing that we saw when we were putting together this issue was just the massive disparity between, the amount of international aid that's gone towards the Syrian crisis versus what has happened as a result of the Venezuelan diaspora. And look, I understand that we're talking about 2 different kinds of crises, and I get that, but still that disparity is huge. Can you talk about that just a little bit before we go over to Feline?
Yes, there is a recent study carried out by Danny Bahar from Brookings Institute. And there is like a paper I can send to you to distribute to the social media of ASCOA. But this says that we are 10 times below the amount of money that the international community has put in other migration crises, as the Rohingya one or as the Syrian one. We are very thankful with the United States, which is our main donor, not only with the government, but also with the Congress, and also with the European Union and some European countries. But notwithstanding that we are really thankful for that, we need more money because in per capita comparison terms, this is the most underfunded migratory crisis in the world right now.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to you with more on that in a little while. Feline, so it's good to see you again. I was in Peru and we saw each other. I was actually there for a week back in February, and you know, Colombia gets the lion's share of the attention when it comes to the Venezuelan diaspora, and rightfully so, because they've absorbed the most people, with 1.7 million estimated and possibly more. Since 2015, but it's almost 900,000 in Peru, which puts it in second place. And one thing that really struck me was, of the 900,000 Venezuelans estimated to be in Peru, I think the number is 780,000 of them are estimated to be in Greater Lima alone. So there's really a big cluster there in that one spot. Can you talk to me? You're so plugged into that community. Can you talk to me about conditions there right now and how they're coping amid the current very difficult moment?
Yes, thank you, Brian. Thank you for the invitation. I think it is important to point out the differences and, of course, the characteristics of the migrant population, Venezuelan migrant and refugee population depends a little bit on the geography. So what we know also from other migration, or I would say displacement contexts, is that the closer migrants and refugees are to their country of origin, often the more vulnerable they are. Or put the other way around, the people that manage to migrate further away, be it Bogota, be it Ecuador, be it Peru, they probably, on average, had greater economic means to get to Peru in the first place. So just to point that out, and even within Colombia, of course, the most vulnerable migrants stay close to the border because they just don't have the means to get any further. Or what we've also seen, increasingly walk to get to their final destinations. So this is something pre-COVID. We already saw this change in characteristics. So where in Peru, whereas the first migrants arrived on airplanes with savings and could really integrate fairly easily into Peruvian or Limenian society. And here I'm talking 2016, 17, still beginning of 2018, what we saw the shift was towards more middle class, lower middle class migration, people arriving on buses. But already the last year, so still pre-COVID, the last year, people started arriving walking, and already more than half, a small majority, started walking all the way from Venezuela to Peru, which is insane. They're more than 30 days, 40 days carrying their belongings, carrying their small children. And those were the conditions in which many arrived already in the last months. It's also important to point out, you spoke about generosity, Brian, and I do agree that there was impressive, unprecedented, I would say, political generosity in receiving this population in the beginning. And this often goes hand in hand, with a shift in public opinion, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit further on. So with increasing xenophobia, we also saw a shift towards more restrictive policies, and Peru, mid-2019, de facto closed its border to legal access for Venezuelans. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because we need to understand that currently a fairly large share, and we don't even know exactly how many of the Venezuelans in Lima do not have legal status, either because their special visa expired or because they actually entered by irregular means. So to come to your question, how are they experiencing this crisis? We have a general lockdown, so we've all been at home, or we're supposed to be at home for the last 5 weeks. This lockdown is enforced by police and the military. So we actually had more than 50,000 people detained for breaking the lockdown last week. And of course, this lockdown affects vulnerable Peruvians, but especially so vulnerable Venezuelans, because many of them, so we have a general problem that a large population works in the informal economy. So if they do not go out and work, they do not eat. Yeah, this affects Peruvians as well. But the problem is that Venezuelans do not have the social networks, right, that could accommodate them or help them in this situation. So we actually, and with this I'll end, but we conducted a flash survey over the weekend. Both the university and the think tank we're collaborating with. And we found that 20% of people have been suffering hunger during this lockdown, 20% of interviewed Venezuelans. 95% did not receive any kind of institutional support, either by the government or I think you were even talking more international organizations or NGOs. Half of them who said that they had felt sick did not receive any attention. And over 50% feared that they would be dislocated, so basically thrown out of their apartments or rooms because they were not able to pay the rent. So I would say, although if we compare these populations, the Venezuelan migrant population in Lima is less vulnerable, maybe much less vulnerable than the migrant population in the Venezuelan Colombia border, the situation is severe. There are many risks implied, and vulnerability is increasing by the day.
Okay, thank you for that, Feline. Let me go back to Lala for a second. You know, I want to ask you, and how have you seen firsthand any of this xenophobia and sort of rejection of Venezuelans that we've been seeing reflected in polls? How does it, if so, how does it usually tend to show up? And you know, I mean, how is that played out kind of in real life for you?
So me being a migrant, I haven't faced it, thanks God. But me working in the field for the migrants and trying to integrate this population to Colombia, there's some kind of as Luisa said, the first time 4 years ago, this was a very welcoming for everybody. But now when these people and the migration started to change, and there was like middle class or the more vulnerable started to cross the border and started to walk through the region, because all those migrants walking to Peru, they will pass through Colombia, they will start addressing the streets. So they will get like the street spaces. So every city in Colombia already had this vulnerable population, as I told you, Brian. So now you are in my space. So I even saw xenophobia or aporophobia, which is a very new term, because people don't like, sometimes you get bored about, or you get used to see this people asking for money and the musicians playing some music in the streets. So for 1 week it's okay, but for 4 or 5 or a month, so you start to normalize the xenophobia. You start to normalize the vulnerable people. So I see it when this vulnerable people arrive to other vulnerable spaces, that's when the conflict comes. That's why my call is to the private sector and the civil society and the local governments to start addressing in a different way to this population. Because in that way, the followers of that, I don't know, mayor or from that politic that is talking about migration, so those followers is going to change the way they see. And this is we need to hold into humanitarian, Brian. That's my call. We need to understand that it's not from one space or with one flag or another. They are on the same vulnerable state. So I think that the xenophobia will arrive when I feel my space is now you arrive to my space, and now I'm going to have less help from the government, less money from the guy who runs every morning through here. So I think that xenophobia is over there where you can see it on the vulnerable people.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, and looking at all of this from the perspective of a political analyst. In my case, you look at some of the polling that existed again prior to this crisis, where there was one poll that was done in Peru that asked people the percentage who agreed with the following statement. This one was done in Peru, but there was similar polling in Colombia. I'm afraid of Venezuelans who are arriving in Peru. And that number in 2018 was 24%. And in 2019, it was 52%. And there was similar polling that suggested that people in the working class felt threatened in the labor market. And look, I mean, amid this pandemic, it's very clear that unemployment is rising and economic activity is shrinking. So it's tough to think about, the fallout that we're likely to see over the next couple months. Although I know that there are governments and officials and civil society organizations and people who are doing their very best to ensure that that's not the case. And I know in the case of the Duque government, in particular in Colombia, there's been, they have continued, even though polls show it's not popular, they have continued to push for policies of inclusion and kind of a rhetoric and emotional treatment of humanity and being civilized to people, which is so important. Let me go to Felipe. Felipe, I had planned on waiting, frankly, to ask questions that came in from the audience, but we're being deluged with quality questions on Twitter and on WebEx as well. For those of you who are watching and want to ask, just tag us with @America's Quarterly and we'll see it. There's two questions, Felipe, and they're kind of related. The first one is, I would like to know how the funds that various countries have donated have been used to help the migration crisis. So that means specifically, what is the funding generally been used for? And then a similar question, the big challenge is, how exactly should the international community increase the support for vulnerable people? I think that's a question kind of about the best mechanism to do so. And I know that you'll have some insight into both of those.
No, thank you very much. So as Colombia is concerned, we have received from the international community $400 million in the last 3 years. It accounts for 130 million per year, which is almost the 10% the money that we need just to work with this kind of amount of population. 1.8 million Venezuelans are living in permanent way in Colombia. Then the international community has helping us in 10%. But really important is just to explain to diagonally is that this money not comes directly to the government, not to the national government, neither to the local governments. They're going through the international organizations, the UN agencies that are helping us, for example, in vaccines, to give money to the kids, to support the women, to give us, to helping us with shelters. And there is a various ways in which the international organization are helping us. Even we create a group, which is the interagency group for the agencies, not only the UN agencies, but also the international and national NGOs, more than 65 of them, working with us very closely, trying to look what is the specific needs of any region in Colombia. And in that way, with the money they receive from the international donor, they can invest in their more organized way. The second part of the question is how the international community can help in us. There is a regional plan organized by the United Nations. And Brian, from January to now, this regional plan for this year that is asking $1.4 billion for the regional crisis has only received 3% of the funds, 3% of the funds from January to now. Then this is one way, which is very good because we organize this regional plan with the United Nations. But also there is a lot of, you can give us bilaterally. If some country decide to give some money in bilateral way to Colombia, we are also very happy to receive them. There is a various ways where you can invest your money, even through the multilateral development banks that they have special funds, World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. We have been working with them very closely, and there is another fund. Then there is a various way as the countries can help us.
Thank you, Felipe. That's an amazing statistic. That 3%. That's wow. So I want to ask all three of you the same question, and it has to do with things that I saw when I was in Peru back in February. And it was a week that I was there, and it was enough time to really at least get a partial feel for the scope of these challenges. And look, I mean, in the Peruvian case and in the Colombian case, we are talking about tremendously difficult challenges to address from the perspective of the state and of society. I mean, to have 1 million people or almost 1 million people in a country of, I think it's 33 million people in Peru in such a short time. And look, I mean, I think it would show, again, I know it's the second time I've said this, but I look at the way that we've struggled with immigration in the United States and in a country with more resources. And then you think about the challenge in a place like Peru and a place like Colombia, and it's really humbling. But if you look across the board, I mean, there's challenges in healthcare, there's challenges in education. My question is, if you're going to integrate these people, and that's the challenge, because polling shows that most Venezuelans don't believe that they'll go home, even in the extremely unlikely event that the crisis in Venezuela ends tomorrow. What is, in your mind, the most pressing logistical challenge to integrating those people? Is it schools? Is it healthcare? Is it something else? And Feline, I'll start with you.
It's a tough question, because I would say the answer changes by the day. So if you would have asked me a couple of weeks ago, I would have probably talked about labor integration and integration into the educational sector. They're all important, right? I think I actually asked Felipe this question a couple of months ago, and it's really tough, because they're all important, right? You could say healthcare is the most important. You could even start with housing, and in Lima, I would have not mentioned housing a couple of weeks ago because it was not a pressing issue. But if we now actually see people being kicked out, right, of their apartments, of their houses, because they're not able to pay the rent, then housing will become maybe even the number one issue, right? And then health, and then labor, and educational integration. But I think it's a really, really difficult question to answer, because they kind of go hand in hand, right? But and are changing by the day. So that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it is tough, but you know, that's. Lala, what do you see as the biggest challenge?
Well, the biggest challenge right now is health, of course. I think right now, like I told you at the first, when we started this conversation about all the challenge that the region have, of course, is staying at home. It's not possible for these people, but also health. On a country and in a region, which health is also a challenge for their own citizens. Also, maybe a bit forward on the conversation, I want to talk about these returns. I think this is kind of a mirage. We can talk about a return right now. Of course, when we talk about migration in the whole world, we need to have this conversation, but we need to have this conversation when this is a reality on the other side. So what really worries me the most is that we are facing a health issue in a few months, when all these people that are going back to Venezuela is going to come back to get treatment here. So Colombia, Peru, and the whole region is going to be covered by COVID in their spaces. But these people that just left, they're going to come back with all the health problems that they already have, plus the treatment for the COVID. So we need help. Colombia and the region needs more help, as Felipe said, because this is going to be a second-time pandemic, and we're going to face a massive, again, migration, as we saw in 2017. So I think the health and how we're going to address all these issues, again, but adding the COVID and the treatment for the COVID for all these people there are these false going back home to get safe. They're not getting safe. They are just getting more vulnerable And we just saw, I don't know if you saw it on the newspaper today, we're just 9 million people in Venezuela are under food insecurity. Those people are the perfect space for a pandemic. And those people are going to cross the border again. So that's where we need to start paying attention for right now and on the midterm and long term. And I think that we need to work with the national government and international to start supporting all the health policies that they are addressing, because this is going to happen. I'm as I told you, I'm been in the field for 2 years, and I'm just scared about this. And thanks God, Colombia just had this. The big cities of the border, those are the ones who have all the support. But we need more, and those are the ones who are going to be. And right now they are like on the top, and they're going to be. I can't imagine November or December 2020 what is going to happen. So we need to support health in order to stop this pandemic that is coming back.
Okay, thank you, Lala. Felipe, you get sort of the last crack at this difficult and perhaps impossible question of what you see as the most pressing challenge right now.
You know, I don't want to sound so philosophical, but I think if choose a specific sector or topic is really hard, because health is really demanding and really challenging. Also, economic inclusion. But, you know, for me, for Colombian government, the most important thing is not to create a specific policy for migrants. It's include migrants in the social policy. Because if not, we create some xenophobic sentiment. The more important goal for us is to understand, to help the Colombian society that this is not more a temporary process. This is a long-term development challenge. And in that way, we need just to consider this population, some of them, because it's not all a vulnerable population. There are a lot of them that are contributing a lot to the society. But the part of them that are vulnerable, we need to include in our vulnerable population. Then the debate is different. It's how we increase the money just to attend the vulnerable population that we have. Not only the Colombian one, but the Venezuelan one. But this distinction, and sometimes when we try to create, and when some agency push just to create a specific policy for migrants, we really rather prefer just to improve our capacity, our social services, just to protect all the vulnerable population, including the Venezuelan migrants, that are going to stay in Colombia for many years.
Yeah, thank you, Felipe. And it sounds to me like you're in sintonia is the word that keeps coming to mind. In synthesis with, I guess that's how you say it in English, with Lala on that one, who, she had talked about the importance of that too. And thank you also for, mentioning the opportunities and all the good things that migration brings. And I feel like partly because of the pandemic and all of our worries about the economic situation, healthcare situation, we're focusing here today on the urgency, on the very tough situation that so many people face. But I do want to be clear on that point of the opportunities that migration brings, all the human skills, all the richness that comes with diversity. And we covered that to a great extent within this issue that we just published of America's Quarterly this week. So please, I would urge everybody watching, if you haven't already, to look through the issue. We have several stories that kind of look at that side of things as well. We have about 10, 15 minutes left and many questions to get to. So let me go to one from Caroline Cronley of the Tinker Foundation, which has done some amazing work on this topic for a while, but especially over the last 6 to 12 months. And Caroline's question is for Lala and anybody else who wants to answer too. It's such an important one. It's, what are the particular challenges facing children from migrant families during the pandemic, and what interventions are working or could work? So why don't we start with Lala? And I'm certain that Feline has thoughts on that as well.
So, of course, I will be repeatedly say this. So the staying home, because it's staying home with almost 10 to 15 people or family members on a really, 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 really small space. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges that these people have, and hunger also. So we're trying as an NGO and civil society and trying to have synergy with the government and with the local governments, because now education, of course, is going to be virtual, but this is not a reality. This is not a reality for our children, for vulnerable children, not migrant children, for all the vulnerable children in Colombia. It's almost impossible to have connectivity and to have these virtual classes. And just imagine having a virtual class on a hunger stomach and also with 15 members of your family around in a really, really tiny space. So I think the big issue that we need to address and we need to support is trying to get food to these families, the health safe in some way, and start working. And then it's my invitation to everybody who's listening here. It's my invitation to see how we can make this virtual education a reality for our vulnerable children, migrants or no migrants, for all our vulnerable children. We need to bring technology to all these children. I'm not talking, Brian, about rural. I'm not talking about in these really, really spaces that they are, I don't know, like in these spaces that where they are, yes, they're rural. No, I'm talking about in cities and border cities that we need technology. We need all the people that are listening to us to bring all their good practices so we can make this a reality.
Thank you. Feline?
Yes. So again, I would say increasingly we see the same kind of vulnerability. We see the hunger among the population right now in this COVID crisis. And maybe to just give you one example, I think sometimes it's really, really hard to imagine, but these are families that do not have any stocks of food in their places. I was in contact with a family we had interviewed various times, a couple with their 3-year-old son. He was a policeman in Venezuela and deserted. He had been working in Peru and Lima as in a delivery service in a restaurant. And they contacted me because they were left with half a package of spaghettis, and that was it. That was what they had. And they were under lockdown and couldn't go out. And they were also scared to get sick. So basically this woman talking to me and asking me for help because all she had left to give her 3-year-old son was half a pack of spaghettis. So definitely, if we think a little bit broader also in terms of educational challenges, in the flash survey we conducted this past weekend, we found that 30% of children had not been enrolled in the school system prior to the crisis. And half of them were participating in Peru, it's not online, it's via television, the schooling, the state schooling. Half of them were participating. And of the half that wasn't, they didn't even know about the program. So I think one thing we maybe have not mentioned yet is information and information gaps. So sometimes there are programs, sometimes state programs in Peru, maybe more NGO or NGO programs or programs led by international organizations, but the information doesn't get to the migrants. And why doesn't it get to the migrants? Because sometimes these organizations are scared of publicly advertising these programs because of xenophobia, right? So because if they publicly say this is for migrants, there's a xenophobic backlash. And if they don't say it's for migrants don't think that they're included. So just, I think it's interesting sometimes to see how these things map out. And then more generally speaking, if we think pre and post COVID, what we saw in Peru, we had, and they are great state initiatives as well. So we had a great program by the regional government to start a parallel school year for all children. So I think what Felipe says is so important. I think both long-term strategy, but also to combat or to not further increase xenophobia, it's important to improve public service delivery for all and to implement programs for all. So we had a parallel school year, more places opened up, 10,000 just for Lima in 2019, and only 6,000, mostly Venezuelan children enrolled, right? But the government knew that there was much more need, really. And then a small study was conducted, and what was found out is that many children cannot go to school because they have to either work or take care of their younger siblings. So again, there are the immediate needs such as eating right now, And then there are more structural concerns. And these kids need to get back into school because many of them have been out of the school system for years. So you already have the challenge that you have 12-year-olds that in theory, where do you place them? And it's very hard to place 12-year-olds to get in the same class with 8 or 9-year-olds because they have missed 2 or 3 years of school, right? So various challenges also for the period post-COVID in this sense.
No, and you've reminded me, Feline, of one of the more striking things that I heard during my week in Peru when I was talking to representatives of the Vizcarra government about the difficulty of getting kids enrolled and to stay in school. And one of the things that one of the officials said was, it's a challenge because the parents work so far away from their place of residence, and nobody's, basically they work in the center of the city and they live on the periphery. And so nobody's there to pick up the kids after school. And I innocently asked, well, isn't that an issue for Peruvians as well, right? Because there are Peruvians who live on the periphery and they're commuting to the center of town. And this official looked at me, like he was surprised by the question. I understand why. And he then realized that he had to explain to me. He said, Peruvians have family. They have networks of family. There's always or usually an aunt or a grandmother or a cousin or somebody like that who can go pick up the kids at school if mom and or dad are working downtown. And that's not the case for a lot of Venezuelans who are new arrivals and who, of course, have become separated from most of their family in the course of moving. It was kind of one of those moments for me that, as a journalist, you're always learning, and it was kind of heartbreaking too, because I realized, with all the things that Venezuelans have already left behind, they've also left behind in a lot of cases those family support networks, and it makes things difficult as well. Before we move on, Felipe, do you have anything to say about this specific question about support and aid, the unique challenges for kids amid this crisis?
No, of course, the kids is a major concern because the capacity that we have just to protect the kids, especially from 0 to 5, is limited. And it creates another situation, which is a burden in the women, that they want to go to work, that they want to buy, even if it's in the informal sector, if they have the kids and they have to take care of the kids, and we don't have the capacity just to offer them enough support just to that we as a government can take the kids. This is an extra burden for the women, which is a very complicated sum of situation, which create for women a more complicated situation. Then we are working with the Institute for Family Welfare here in Colombia that has done a very incredible job. We need to strengthen their kids' capacity just to strengthen our capacity just to can have more spaces just to protect the kids from 0 to 5. And in that way, we can liberate the women and they can go and find another ways to live.
So we have so many good questions and we're almost out of time. There's one here that I want to address because it touches on some themes that we've already discussed here on the call. And let me read the question and then connect it back to some of the things we've said. It says, it's clear that the virus affects us all, but the migration population may require a differentiated response because of the greater levels of vulnerability. There's been agreement among the panelists that it's probably not a good idea most of the time to draw these distinctions. When it comes to just the very front lines public health response to this pandemic, and Felipe, I'll start with you. Is it a good idea? Should there be special programs given an elevated level of vulnerability, or do you think that's a mistake on several levels?
No, I think we need just to create a guaranteed healthcare access. We can't create any specific programs even for COVID and tomorrow for SARS and tomorrow, and because it creates a differentiation that doesn't exist. This pandemic doesn't ask for passport. The government response neither asks for passport. Then we have to guarantee the healthcare access, and of course, we need to strengthen some of the information because this is a vulnerable population. But at the same time that we are supporting the migrant population with food baskets, we came with a food basket for the Colombian society. Because if you create some difference, you create a xenophobic sentiments, and we need to create a sense of community. Then no, we create a plan just to include in the public response the migrants.
Lala, any thoughts on that?
I totally agree with Felipe. Of course, we can challenge and we can start working with the government that is doing those things, but we can't forget all the challenges that this population have. So we need to have them covered, as you said. So in Peru, when you asked how this kid, who's going to pick up these children, so most of the Venezuelans, they won't have anyone to take care of the children, and I need to go to work. So we see and we face all these children in the streets with their parents working with them. So in order that keep supporting all the actions that already the government and the national government is addressing with the NGOs and local NGOs and international NGOs about the migration, but about the pandemic, we need to integrate and we need to have the same channels to the whole population. I think it's just not forgetting that there's also a pandemic about hunger and about necessities that this migration population has turned into vulnerable population in the host countries that they arrive.
Feline, any thoughts before we conclude?
Yes, I'd actually like to take it a step further. I think this should be an opportunity to make sure that passports don't matter for the access to healthcare, not just in this crisis, but beyond the crisis. And this is also something you actually cover in the recent issue of America's Quarterly. This already was a public health issue before COVID, but it wasn't seen as that. So we already had the issue of infectious diseases really picking up in Venezuela, and diseases do not know passports and they do not know territorial borders, right? So they would even travel without migrants. They travel faster with migrants, and there should not be any differentiation on the basis of nationality or migratory status ever in public health care. And I just hope that maybe this crisis that has made this more obvious will be an opportunity for policymakers in the region to see this risk and to see the necessity really out of not only from a human rights or rights-based approach, but also out of their self-interest to incorporate migrants in their public health policies.
Okay, thank you. One final thought. I mean, one of my favorite pieces in this issue was in every issue of America's Quarterly, we publish a piece called The Long View, which is a look at sometimes forgotten chapters of Latin American history. And in this issue, we had a really good one that was about Caracas and Venezuela generally in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And, you know, that was a period when Venezuela was receiving people from elsewhere in the region, specifically Colombians and Peruvians who were fleeing political chaos and other forms of trouble. And I know that memories are short sometimes in this world that we live in, but I was also struck in my conversations when I was in both Peru and Colombia, how many people still have that sense of gratitude and of a debt being repaid during the present moment. And I think we all recognize how difficult that is in practice and the strains that are being put upon these countries from just these massive numbers of people pouring out of not only Venezuela, but some other Nicaragua, Haiti, some other places in the region as well. So it's a trying time. It was trying before the pandemic. It's even more difficult now. But I continue to be sincerely touched. And this is not just, trying to put a happy face on things, but sincerely touched by the warm reactions and in the conversations that I had with Venezuelans in Peru and in Colombia, they saw certainly a lot of that as well. So I think we covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the various challenges that the region faces. Thank you so much to Feline, to Lala, to Felipe once again. And for more, please check out the latest issue of America's Quarterly, which is present on our site. So thank you for joining us and have a good one.
Thank you. Thank you very much.